Picture a morning roughly 100,000 years ago. The sun is climbing, a small group of people stirs near the cooling embers of a fire, and here's the question that should stop you cold. What are they actually about to do with their day? We have this instinct to imagine ancient humans in a constant, grinding battle for survival. Every waking hour spent fleeing predators, desperately clawing for food, barely making it to nightfall. But the evidence tells a more interesting story. Before farming ever existed, before villages and grain stores and property lines, people had a daily rhythm. They had routines, and understanding those routines changes everything about how you see human history. Let's start at the very beginning of the toolkit. By about 2.6 million years ago, early hominins were already shaping hammerstones and flake tools sharp enough to cut through meat and process plant foods. Think about what that means for a single day. You wake up, and instead of tearing at a carcass with your bare hands, you've got a purpose-made cutting edge. Those tools didn't just change what people ate, they changed how long it took to eat, how much nutrition they could extract, and how much time they had left over for everything else. Then fire arrived and rewrote the evening entirely. By around 790,000 years ago, there's clear evidence of controlled fire use. Cooking didn't just make food taste better, it broke down tough fibers and unlocked nutrients that a raw diet couldn't deliver as efficiently. It also pushed back the darkness, made camps dramatically safer, and gave groups a place to gather after the sun dropped. That campfire wasn't just warmth, it was the original social infrastructure. Fast forward to about 400,000 years ago, and you've got wooden spears, actual engineered hunting weapons. The ones found at Schoningen in Germany were crafted for large game like horses. Now hunting large animals with a wooden spear is not something you do impulsively on a Tuesday morning. It requires scouting, coordination, planning, and a serious tolerance for risk. Hunting was a genuine part of the daily and weekly rhythm, but it wasn't the whole picture, not even close. So, what was the whole picture? This is where modern forager research becomes genuinely fascinating, even if it comes with important caveats. The Kung people of the Kalahari, studied in the 1960s by anthropologist Richard Lee, spent roughly 12 to 19 hours per week on direct subsistence work, hunting, gathering, finding food. A working day ran about 6 hours, and the most active hunter in the study maxed out at around 32 hours in a single week. That's not a frantic survival machine. That's closer to a part-time schedule by modern standards. But here's where the numbers get more nuanced. When you widen the lens to include food preparation, tool repair, and general household tasks, the picture shifts. Men were putting in roughly 44.5 hours per week, women around 40. So the work was real, it was physical, and it was varied. It just looked very different from a 9 to 5. The Hadza of Tanzania add another layer. Time budget studies show Hadza adults spending roughly 5 to 7 hours daily on a mix of foraging, childcare, tool maintenance, and camp upkeep. Even older children pull their weight, gradually taking on more economic tasks as they grow. And all of that activity comes at a cost. Hadza adults burn around 2,800 calories per day, which reflects just how physically demanding this life genuinely was. These are not sedentary people with extra leisure time. They are active, capable, and efficient. Now, a crucial honesty check. The Kung and Hadza live in specific environments in the 20th and 21st centuries. They are not time capsules from the Pleistocene. Ecological pressures, neighboring cultures, and centuries of change all shape how they live. Using them as a perfect blueprint for what life looked like 50,000 years ago is a mistake. Archaeological evidence, where patterns on tools, fire pits, animal bones with cut marks, tells us what people were doing in the broadest strokes, but the finer grain of daily life is genuinely hard to recover. What we can say with confidence is this: the Paleolithic day was shaped by stone, fire, cooperation, and a physical intensity most of us will never experience. It was not chaos, it was not endless terror, it was structured, purposeful, and deeply human, and it was about to get completely transformed by something no forager could have seen coming. Around 10,000 BCE, something fundamental broke. Not the people, the pattern groups that had spent tens of thousands of years moving across landscapes following animals and seasonal plants started staying put. They planted seeds, they built walls, they came back to the same place tomorrow and the day after and the year after that. And in doing so, they didn't just change where they lived, they changed what a day meant. This is the Neolithic shift, and it rewired the structure of human time. In ways we're still living inside. The new toolkit tells you everything. Polished and ground stone tools replaced the older chipped varieties, more labor to make, more durable, more specialized. Pottery appeared, which sounds modest until you realize that a clay vessel for storing grain is not just a container. It's a commitment. It says, we have surplus, we intend to stay, and we are going to manage what we produce rather than consume it on the move. Weaving arrived, too, turning raw animal fiber and plant material into textiles, another technology that ties you to a place, a loom, a routine. Picture a morning in one of these early villages, somewhere in the ancient Near East. The work begins almost immediately, and it doesn't vary much day to day. Women, and likely some men, are crouching over stone querns, flat grinding stones, pushing grain back and forth with a handstone, reducing wheat or barley to rough flour. We know this from the grinding tools themselves, from the wear patterns on human skeletal remains that show the repetitive stress of exactly this motion, and from early Neolithic sites like Göbekli Tepe, where plant food processing equipment clusters around habitation areas. It's worth being honest here. We're reading material clues, and some of the finer details of who did what and when remain inferential, but the physical evidence of grinding, of storage vessels, of hearths and animal pens is real and consistent across dozens of early settlements. Beyond the grain, there were animals to tend: goats, sheep, early cattle, their needs dictated by biological clocks that didn't care about your own. Crops demanded weeding, watering where possible, protection from birds and weather. Pottery required fuel, clay preparation, shaping and firing. Textiles required spinning before weaving could even begin. The point is that each of these technologies created its own recurring labor cycle, and those cycles stacked on top of each other into something that looked, for the first time, like a schedule. Here's the part that tends to surprise people. We have this intuition that farming must have been an upgrade. More food, more security, an easier life. But the evidence doesn't quite support that comfortable story. Farming likely demanded somewhere around 40 to 45 hours of labor per week, which is broadly comparable to the full inclusive work estimates for foragers once tool-making and food preparation were factored in. What changed wasn't necessarily the total hours. What changed was the texture of those hours. Forager work was varied, often social and geographically distributed across a landscape. Neolithic work was repetitive, place-bound, and increasingly tied to specific tasks that a specific person was responsible for. That repetition, though, produced something new: surplus. When you can store grain and manage animals, you can produce more than your household immediately needs, and surplus unlocks a social logic that foraging rarely required. Somebody can spend their day making pots for others. Somebody else can specialize in particular tools or textiles. Community organization starts to reflect the division of that labor. Who produces what? Who decides how it's distributed? This is still a small village, not a state or a civilization, but the architecture of later complexity is already sketched in the routines of these early settlements. The daily life of a Neolithic farmer was more scheduled, more specialized, and more anchored to a single place than anything that came before. Whether that was better is a genuinely complicated question, one that archaeologists and anthropologists are still arguing about. But here's the takeaway worth sitting with. The ancient humans we tend to imagine as primitive were neither leisurely wanderers nor desperate survivors grinding out a miserable existence. In both their foraging and their farming lives, they were organized, skilled, and busy in ways that should look uncomfortably familiar. So the next time you assume the past was simpler, think again and maybe reconsider what your own daily routine is really built on.